Do you know your reptile? Believe it or not, nearly 5 million U.S. homes kept more than 9 million reptiles as pets in 2016. Well, caring for these exotic creatures can be a bit different than your average cat and dog. On this episode of the Paw Report, we're joined by Dr. Sara Reich, who treats wildlife and exotic pets at the University of Illinois College of Veterinary Medicine, the Wildlife Clinic. She'll share with us some advice for current or prospective reptile owners. So stay with us.
Fetcher's Pet Supply on the north side of the Charleston Square, serving the EIU community since 1991. Fetcher's welcomes all pets on a leash, is open 7 days a week, and offers made in the USA food. Pet supplies for dogs, cats, reptiles, and fish. Fetcher's Pet Supply in Charleston.
The Paw Report on WEIU is supported by Rural King, America's farm and home store, livestock feed, farm equipment, pet supplies, and more. You can find your store and more information regarding Rural King at ruralking.com.
Dave's Decorating Center is a proud supporter of the Paw Report on WEIU. Dave's Decorating Center features the Mohawk Smart Strand Silk Forever Clean Carpet. Dave's Decorating Center, authorized Mohawk Color Center in Charleston.
And thanks for joining us for this episode of the Paw Report. We are joined by a repeat guest, and we are so glad she is here from the University of Illinois Wildlife Clinic, Dr. Sara Reich. And she's brought with her a very special friend, her little buddy Wesley, and we're going to talk about Wesley and what exactly he is coming up. But Sara, thank you for joining us. This time we're in studio instead of being at the Wildlife Clinic. We do appreciate you inviting our crew there. This summer, we're talking about reptiles, selecting the right reptile for your family, how to keep them healthy. We're going to get into all of that for the next half hour. But first, tell our viewers about you and your position at the Wildlife Clinic, what the clinic does at the U of I, and all that good stuff.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. And so kind of my jobs are, one, to help teach a lot of the veterinary students that are over there, different courses, classes, things like that, but then also to oversee the medical care at the Wildlife Clinic. And our Wildlife Clinic is very unique in that it is basically student run. So we have about 120-ish veterinary and undergraduate students who take on the care of our wildlife patients, everything from intake exams to diagnostic tests like blood work and x-rays and things like that. Even surgical procedures these guys get to take part in. So it's quite amazing. We see about around 2,000 patients every year, the majority coming in during the summertime. So we're quite busy around May to August. And we do actually see tons of reptile species in our wildlife clinic, but then also tons of them are kept as pets.
What other types of species do you have in the clinic?
Yeah, so we have basically we treat all native species to Illinois or the Midwest. So we take in birds, mammals, and reptiles. We see, reptile-wise, we see mainly turtles or chelonians, so turtles and tortoises, box turtles, painted turtles, snapping turtles, all sorts of things like that. Mammal-wise, I mean, everything from cottontail rabbits and squirrels to foxes, coyotes, fawns, deer, things like that. And then birds, everything. So from raptors, so bald eagles, red-tailed hawks, turkey vultures, things like that, to great blue herons and tiny birds like robins and chickadees and things like that. So really a huge span of every creature that we could see out there.
So your passion is probably more the wildlife side of animals, but you do have a household of animals, one of which is Wesley that you brought today, fitting because our whole episode today is on reptiles.
Exactly.
Tell us about Wesley and his coloring and what's his makeup?
Yeah, so we all wish we could be as camera ready as Wesley is. So Wesley is a bearded dragon. He's about 3 years old, so he's an adult. He's about as big as he's gonna get, and he's a little on the chunky side. I will give him that. So these guys are probably one of the more common species you'll have in the kind of pet situation, exotic pets. Very, very easy to take care of. His species is from Australia, however, he is captive bred, so there's that. But he's great. His coloring you had mentioned before, so bearded dragons come in a variety of colors, different morphs and things like that. He, on his good days when he's nice and warm and happy, he's this very brilliant yellow-orange. Right now he's a little chilly, and as you can see, he's also a little red on his chin because he ate some raspberries this morning, which is kind of his go-to snack.
You know, interest in reptiles, especially for pets, is really growing in the United States. Talk about that and why maybe it is gaining in popularity.
So we've definitely seen an increase in trend of individuals keeping these pets, sometimes considered exotic pets, although and then you think a rabbit, a guinea pig, a budgie is an exotic pet, so you're like, oh, I don't know if that really fits. So some individuals will call them non-traditional species. In our kind of service, usually we call them zoologic species because really they're things you could have at a zoo as well as in your homes. And I think individuals are just realizing that they're fun to keep. They're sometimes just as social and as interactive as dogs and cats. He may not look like it, but he is definitely a very fun and interactive pet to have. And they can be easy to take care of and long-lived pets too, for sometimes decades if you do it well. So I think people are very interested in pursuing those paths. And we get to see them all the time.
How do you interact with Wesley? I mean, obviously you hold him. I asked you if you let him run around your place, and you said, sometimes I do. But I think that might be what viewers are saying. Well, how do you interact with something like this?
And obviously, like, I'm not saying this is for all species, but especially bearded dragons, and we'll probably get into later species that I definitely would recommend. They are, once you handle them on a regular basis, they tame down really easily, especially if you get them from babies. And you can take them on leashed walks. You can bring them out and let them sit on the couch with you when you're watching TV. We were talking earlier, I have a menagerie at home.
You do?
I have some cats, some dogs, some birds, and they all interact with each other, but we've kind of set that up over the last few years so they're all comfortable with that. But yeah, he comes out of his cage every single day. He goes on walks outside when it's warm outside. He can spend some outdoor time in the sun in the summertime. And he's very handleable, and he takes it very, very well.
What types of reptiles, a bearded dragon would be one, but what types of reptiles would you say are commonly housed as pets these days?
So definitely bearded dragons, and I might be a little biased towards them. They're the best. But as far as lizards go, people will keep things like iguanas, which I may or may not suggest, leopard geckos, chameleons, things like that. People will keep a lot of turtles, so anything from a tortoise or a turtle, they're both considered chelonians, but they're not the same. So people will keep Russian tortoises, red-footed tortoises, things like that, as well as aquatic little guys like red-eared sliders, painted turtles. And then you go over to your snake species, and really ball pythons, corn snakes are probably going to be the two main species that you're going to be seeing. But with this interest in all of these pets, you see more and more breeders and more species that are kept nowadays, more so than just the common guys.
I asked you, and it probably showed my ignorance in reptiles, but I said, oh, is the bearded dragon part of the iguana family? And you're like, no, not really. They are different, but they look alike.
No, definitely. So they're both obviously lizards. So similar in that degree, basically, so different than your snakes and your turtles. But they are different species. They're in different families. Like I said before, bearded dragons are from Australia. Your iguanas are found usually Central South America, unless they're encroaching on Florida and southern U.S. and all sorts of things like that. But yeah, similar in that they're both lizards, but very different in their habitats and their what they like to do and live and all sorts of things.
How should I know what to choose if I'm thinking about bringing a reptile into my family?
Yeah.
How do I know what I should get?
Yeah, and I think there's a good and bad about the internet. So there is a lot of good information out there, but sometimes it's hard to distinguish that from not so good information. And so usually what I tell people when they're thinking about choosing a pet, and honestly this is the same for dogs and cats, is I tell them to reach out to their veterinarian, or at least find a veterinarian that's comfortable treating these species and asking them, because they're going to give you a good representation of who needs medical care all the time, or who is actually easier to house, all sorts of things. I'd rather individuals be asking those individuals instead of the people selling them at pet stores or something like that. But they can be great resources for letting individuals know what is good to keep, what is not, what is easier to keep, what is a little harder to keep, maybe where to start versus if you've already worked with a starter or beginner reptile, maybe where to advance from there.
Speaking of where to start,
Yeah.
I think probably the first thing is homework. Don't just rush out to some place or get online and order something. I think you need to start with your homework. There's a lot of things we should go through.
Oh, yes.
First of all is maybe once you pick your species, you need to look at habitat.
Oh, yes.
So let's start with you've picked your species and then where you go from there. Habitat, food, medical, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I can use bearded dragons as kind of our example, if you will. But it is extremely important to go through, habitat and housing and all sorts of things with these guys, because truthfully, a lot of their issues, why they're presenting to, say, a veterinary practice, all stems from issues with their husbandry, which is housing, diet, enrichment, all sorts of things. So basically when you get one of these guys, things to consider are, one, what age you're getting them at. So I got Wesley when he was a baby. So he was about 6-7 inches long, and he is obviously not anymore.
Right.
And so the sizes even of just his tank size have gone up exponentially during that time frame. And originally he may have been in a 20-gallon tank, but now he's in a 75-gallon tank. And so you have to kind of recognize that there are costs associated with kind of a starter cost for these guys. But if they're going to get much larger than the size you got them at, you have to think about that.
You have to grow with them.
You have to grow with them, exactly, and that's actually one of the main reasons why we may see these guys presenting to a shelter or a rescue group or something like that, is that they have kind of outlived the size of their container or enclosure, and individuals either can't or won't increase those opportunities for them, and so they would just surrender them. And it can get quite expensive for some of your larger reptiles, and so it is something you need to think about in the beginning when you're buying them, maybe a year, 2, 3 years before even needing to make those decisions. So enclosure is a really big one. Most of our reptiles often do well in things like tanks and things like that, so something that may look like an aquarium, but some of our species don't. Some of our species need open mesh areas, some of our chameleons and our climbing species. Tortoises and turtles, especially tortoises, may just need a large open area. They probably won't do well in a tank, but give them a 4x4 pen or stick them outside or something like that, and they can do really, really well. So really need to think about the species you're working with and kind of where they would live in the wild, how they would live in the wild, and trying to recreate that as best as possible is going to be kind of that first big step.
What about nutrition? And each species will be different, I understand that, but we can use Wesley as a starting point, and maybe some other species you could talk about. And some of what they eat may be live in nature, and pet owners may be squeamish feeding a snake a live animal of sorts. Definitely,
and I think people need to definitely recognize what the ideal diet is for these guys, and recognize if you're able to provide that. Because if you're not interested in providing rodents, and we'll get to that a little bit later, maybe get an herbivore, maybe get one that's actually going to be interested in veggies and fruits and things like that. So bearded dragons are actually a really good example, because when they're babies, when they're juveniles, they actually need a higher protein diet, which usually means insects, sometimes small rodents, things like that. But you're introducing fruits and veggies into their lives. But as they get older, that kind of switches, and so they become more herbivorous. So they eat more of a salad overfed veggies, fruits. And so, like I said, this guy has a little bit raspberry face going on this morning, but he primarily eats fruits and veggies, and he only gets insects and protein sources maybe once a week or once every other week, because that's kind of what his body needs, and that's what he would eat in the wild. People don't recognize that, and some of our bigger problems with these guys is that they're overfed protein, they're overfed insects, mice, especially when they should transition over, or maybe they're not even a species that eats those things on a regular basis, and people don't recognize that they are an herbivore, which actually happens in our iguana species a lot. And then they can get some problems with that. But as far as snakes go, so true carnivores, so only eating your rodents and your mammals and things like that. And I think one thing people need to recognize is that you don't need to be feeding live prey, and it's something that I actually recommend not doing, because it's not the most humane for the rodent that you're feeding. It's not natural to stick a mouse into a cage and have the snake have a tiny little space to eat it. And also sometimes those rodents fight back, especially if that snake isn't interested at that moment or can't catch them immediately. Rodents are going to fight back because they're prey species and they're going to try to defend themselves. And so we generally recommend for those species that are feeding on a rodent-based food to get pre-frozen ones, basically. And most, if not all, snakes will transition over to a frozen-based diet. And we truly recommend that because once you've seen some of the injuries that a rodent can cause to some of our snakes, you never want to look back from that.
Right.
Yeah.
You need to think about safety too, not just for your pet, but also for your family.
Yeah.
When you're thinking about bringing one in.
Yeah.
You can probably address that too.
Yeah, definitely. So, and I think that goes to the thought process of what you're gonna get, kind of thing. So bearded dragons are very tameable once you're handling them a lot. A lot of your snake species, ball pythons, are very tameable when you're handling them a lot. But if you're not handling them on a regular basis, or you're getting some of the species that may be a little bit more jumpy, a little bit more territorial, like maybe iguana or something like that, you do need to recognize that especially an adult can cause some damage. And so you need to prepare for that beforehand and really handle them on a daily basis so they're comfortable with you, they're comfortable with other individuals handling them, because worst case scenario would be that they lash out, usually out of fear or hunger or what have you, and have those animals be surrendered only because they're just not comfortable around people yet. So yeah, handling is the number one thing you can do to avoid that, and most of our species do beautifully with it.
But they aren't dogs. You know, you don't want to kiss them and snuggle with them and sleep with them, correct?
No, yeah. I mean, I guess we could take a nap together.
Yeah.
He's like, fine. But yeah, no, some of our species do carry risks of certain diseases. So the big thing that people think about, especially for our aquatic species, is like salmonella and all sorts of things like that. And obviously you don't want to stick that in your mouth or your hands in your mouth after you're handling these guys. So usually I recommend for individuals to wash their hands after every single time you're handling these guys to keep their habitats as clean as possible. So if they do poop in their cage, you want to clean that up as soon as possible, not only for your health, but also for these guys, because you don't want them walking through that. But yeah, you're usually not going to be snuggling these guys. You're usually not going to be kissing them on the nose or anything like that, but you can still handle them, walk them, interact with them, all sorts of things.
You're an expert. Well, you are. You direct a wildlife center, but somebody like me, I'm not. So there are probably some reptiles. I would say I could probably do okay with the bearded dragon.
Definitely.
But there are some reptiles, as you very openly admitted, that you probably wouldn't have just because they're hard to take care of.
Yeah, definitely. So I think two species come to mind when I think about reptiles that I generally don't recommend and I personally wouldn't have, are going to be an iguana and a chameleon for different reasons. So iguanas can be beautiful pets, and they're gorgeous animals. They become quite large, but they become quite large, and so they can be very powerful animals. And if they are not hand trained and very approachable, they can cause a lot of damage, and they both bite and will slap with their tails, and it can cause some damage. And this can only worsen as they age, as they mature, as they get into that kind of territorial mode. They can be quite dangerous animals. And then also, again, they get quite large, so they need the space kind of encourage that growth. And so individuals that I've seen who have had iguanas and done them appropriately have whole rooms of their house just for those iguanas, so they can have trees to climb on and branches and mister setups and all sorts of things like that to give them basically a tropical environment in an entire room of the house. And so they're harder to handle, they're harder to upkeep, so it's not an animal that I would recommend for most people, and they're one of the most commonly surrendered or rescued animals because they get to a certain size and then people can't have them anymore. And then as far as chameleons go, they stay small, so we see usually a few species of chameleons, veiled chameleons, panther chameleons, Jacksons, and they're beautiful. Don't get me wrong, they are some of the most gorgeous species of reptiles you can have, but they are very sensitive to environmental changes, they're very sensitive to diet changes. You need like the most accurate setup for these guys, diet, humidity, caging, all sorts of things like that. And if things are not on point, they don't do well. And they usually decrease in function very, very quickly. And so they can drop weight, they stop eating, they don't bask under their lights, all sorts of things like that. And they can pass away really, really quickly. And it's just one of those things where we know a fair amount about their environment, but sometimes it can be hard to recreate it, even though we have all of these options commercially, that they're just not a species that I recommend, at least for a beginner, alrighty? If you have gone through all of your reptiles and you're like, yeah, I can do this on point, I can provide for them the appropriate housing, vet care, all sorts of things like that, and you're like, I want a challenge, great, awesome. But if you're looking for a beginner species, bearded dragons, ball pythons, leopard geckos, which stay nice and small, those are probably going to be the ways to go because they're just hardy species.
When you have somebody bring in a reptile to the clinic for treatment, what is most commonly the biggest problem with reptiles as far as health-wise?
Yeah. So obviously different in our wild patients versus our domestic patients. So when we get wild patients coming to our wildlife medical clinic, I'd say the majority of those guys are trauma-based, unfortunately.
Hit by
cars, grabbed by dogs, all sorts of things like that, and then a few cases of infectious disease, but primarily trauma. For our pet species, I'd say 80-90% of the time, their issues are stemming from some sort of husbandry problem. So something is wrong with their housing setup, their lighting setup, their heat, their food, their water, humidity, all sorts of things like that. And if caught soon enough and corrected soon enough, they can do just great. But sometimes it's gone on for so long that it can be a little bit harder to correct those things. So things that we specifically see related to that are going to be shedding problems, which is called dysecdysis. So that's going to be if these guys aren't shedding appropriately. So bearded dragons are a good example of reptiles that will shed in bits and pieces. So it's normal for this guy, and you can actually see his tail is a little darker on one segment than the other. And so he sheds bits and pieces. So he'll shed his head and then his arms and his body all separately. Snakes are a good example of a species that will shed all in one, kind of like a tube. And so you have to know what they normally shed like. So it would be normal for this guy to have bits and pieces. But if you saw that on a snake, you're like, oh no, that's absolutely wrong.
That's not right.
And so dysecdysis is, like I said, when it doesn't come off appropriately. And so usually that's related to husbandry problems, humidity in particular. And so usually if humidity is too low, they don't have enough moisture in their skin to actually have those extra layers separate, and so it gets stuck onto them. And so the nice thing is once you correct the humidity and you help them through that current shed that they're having a problem with, often they do just fine, but sometimes you kind of have to help it along a little bit. And it's not something that I'd recommend owners trying to do because you never want to peel off the skin, because you can actually damage the scales underneath. It has to be a very gentle, gradual process. Sometimes done under sedation or anesthesia if it's super duper bad. So we see that quite commonly. And if you think about it, wintertime, it's so dry. And people don't recognize that. And if you look at this guy, he's from Australia. Well, he's not. He's from here, but his species is from
Ancestors.
Australia. And so they're used to drier environments, but that doesn't mean they like it 10-20% humidity, which is what it is in the wintertime. They're happy where we're at in like the 40-50 range. But your tropical species, they want it 80-90% humidity. And if you can't give them misters and like waterfalls and like all sorts of things like that, it can be quite common for them to have those problems. And then other issues we see are dietary related. So we see something called nutritional secondary hyperparathyroidism. People like to call it metabolic bone disease, but that's kind of a simplistic term for it, and they don't always have bony changes. But usually what happens in those situations is they're not either getting enough appropriate lighting, so UVB light actually helps with this process, or they're not getting the correct diet. And so usually the problem is calcium and vitamin D regulation, and something is going wrong with, again, either that lighting or their diet where they're not getting enough, and they'll have problems with their bones. So you can see breaks, you can see bending, you can see decreased calcium deposition, you can see just general kind of suppression or immunosuppression. So they're just more likely to get infections. So you'll see upper respiratory disease, pneumonia, things like that. You'll get shedding problems, you'll get weight loss, just the
A lot of things like we have,
I know, right?
besides shedding.
Whole skew of things, basically. And again, if you catch those things early enough, you can kind of halt that process. You may never change if they're growing at the time and they have like weird little bones. You may never change that, but you can get them to feeling healthy again. But if it's too late, sometimes you can't get them through that, which is really unfortunate because you want to know the appropriate diet and housing and all sorts of things for these reptiles. And we have that information. It's just not always people have that.
Great. Well, Dr. Reich, thank you so much for traveling to Charleston, bringing Wesley, your buddy, with us, and surely providing our viewers with some very informative information about living with reptiles.
Yeah.
So for this episode of the Paw Report, we thank Dr. Reich, and we thank you, our viewers, for joining us. Until next time, I'm your host, Kelly Goodwin.
Dave's Decorating Center is a proud supporter of the Paw Report on WEIU. Dave's Decorating Center features the Mohawk Smart Strand Silk Forever Clean Carpet. Dave's Decorating Center, authorized Mohawk Color Center in Charleston.
The Paw Report on WEIU is supported by Rural King, America's farm and home store, livestock feed, farm equipment, pet supplies, and more. You can find your store and more information regarding Rural King at ruralking.com.
Fetcher's Pet Supply on the north side of the Charleston Square, serving the EIU community since 1991. Fetcher's welcomes all pets on a leash, is open 7 days a week, and offers made in the USA food. Pet supplies for dogs, cats, reptiles, and fish. Fetcher's Pet Supply in Charleston.
Additional support for the Paw Report on WEIU is brought to you by viewers like you. Thank you.